Hey everyone, welcome to online youth group this week. Woohoo! No Zooms, so I'm sorry about that. But hopefully this works for you too. So we are going to be finishing up our last week of our Atypical Family series. So we've been talking about families for the last couple weeks with a brief break last week to talk about racial injustice. So let's get right into it. Today we're going to be talking about forgiveness, and there are probably a million reasons why we might need to forgive a family member in our life, especially siblings. But in some situations, forgiveness is easier than it is than others. So we're going to do a quick would you rather. Would you rather forgive a sibling for eating your candy or eating your pizza? I would rather forgive a sibling for eating my candy because you had better not take my pizza. Would you rather forgive a sibling for stealing your money or stealing your friend? I think I'd rather have them steal my money than my friend. That would not be cool. Would you rather forgive a sibling for tripping you on purpose or tripping you by accident? For me, I feel like it would be easier for me to forgive them for tripping me on purpose, I think, because if they admit that they did it on purpose, then I could forgive them. But if it was an accident, I might still think that they did it on purpose. Maybe not. I don't know. I guess it depends on the situation. Would you rather forgive a sibling for lying to you or lying about you to someone else? I don't want to forgive my sibling for either of those things. Let's be real. But I guess lying to me? Sorry, I thought I knocked something over. I didn't. No worries. Would you rather forgive a sibling for pushing you or embarrassing you? I would rather forgive them for pushing me because I do not want to be embarrassed. I don't like it. So, what about you? What were your would you rathers? Here's the thing. We've all needed to forgive or be forgiven by a family member at some point because let's face it, no family is perfect because families are just full of people, and this may be a surprise to you, but people are never perfect. Sometimes people hurt each other. Sometimes it's by accident and sometimes it's on purpose. And that means that in every family, people are going to hurt each other. It's just what happens. So we've been talking the past couple weeks about typical and atypical families. When typical families hurt each other, they can respond with bitterness, anger, revenge, holding on to all of that stuff. And we've talked so far about how atypical families respond to life through prayer. They have tough and open conversations together, and they don't hold on to anger. Atypical families hurt each other too, but instead of pursuing revenge, atypical families pursue forgiveness. At some point, we all need to forgive or be forgiven by our families. Sometimes forgiving our family members is easy, but when someone has deeply hurt us, forgiveness can be a lot more difficult. Typical families let their feelings of hurt and offenses go unresolved until they result in bitterness, broken relationships, or even revenge. But atypical families know the value of forgiveness. Their relationships with their families are too valuable to lose. So far in this series, we've met the family of Adam and Eve, the family of their descendant Abraham, the family of Abraham's grandsons Jacob and Esau, and today we're going to introduce you to another generation of this same family. Because even though this family started with disobedience, God used them to do great things. So we're going to be looking at Jacob's son Joseph and his brothers. And we've talked about Joseph before, even this year, not too long ago, in the Stronger series. So you're probably familiar with this story, but today we're going to focus specifically on Joseph's relationship with his family, specifically his brothers. So let's take a look at Genesis 37, 1 through 10. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and it stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Can you just imagine your sibling, your younger sibling, saying, "I had this dream where you bowed down to me and I was in charge"? Ooh, I'd be so mad. And his brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were all bowing to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So let's think about these family dynamics. Joseph is his father's favorite, clearly, and he isn't quiet about it, the father. He makes it pretty clear. He makes him an awesome, ornate robe. He treats him differently. His brothers are all working on the fields, and Joseph is just like hanging out. Joseph then decides it's a good idea to tell his brothers that someday they're going to all serve him. And for obvious reasons, his brothers didn't like it. Now, I'm not defending what Joseph's brothers do to him later, but let's be clear. Joseph wasn't totally innocent. He was arrogant and a little obnoxious, and it's no surprise that they were annoyed with him. I don't know about you, but I always thought my younger brother was spoiled. He didn't have to do things that my older brother and I did. He barely had any chores. Now, I don't know if that was really true. I don't know if he really had more freedom. I don't know if he was really more spoiled or he really had less chores, but it felt true at the time. It was pretty frustrating. And I imagine Joseph's brothers felt that way too. When I turned 16, I had to get a job and work. And you know what? My brother didn't. He didn't start working until college. How fair is that? The rules somehow changed from my older brother and I all the way down to my younger brother, who's 7 years younger. And my older brother and I, we were a little bitter about the special treatment this young kid got that we didn't get. It made us a little annoyed. So anyway, one day, Joseph's brothers are working hard in the fields, and Joseph heads out to meet them, wearing his fancy coat, of course. But they saw him in the distance. This is what Scripture said. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said to each other. "Come, now let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing, the big fancy one, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there wasn't any water in it. And they sat down to eat their meal, and they looked up and they saw a caravan coming. The camels were loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. They agreed to sell him into slavery. So when the merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. And then they took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore off his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" They got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to his father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's Joseph's." He recognized it, and he said, "This is my son's robe. Clearly some animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for many days for his son. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." And his father Jacob wept for him. Meanwhile, Joseph was sold in Egypt to Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials at the time. He was the captain of the guard. Does anyone else get really annoyed with their siblings when they're pain in the butts? Imagine you and your siblings are outside, sweating in the sun, you're hard at work. Your brother, your dad's favorite, comes strutting over to you, wearing his fanciest, most expensive coat, while you're covered in sweat and dirt, and he's the only one who doesn't have to work. Clearly, he has not come to lend you a hand because he's in his fancy clothes. Joseph's brothers were tired of Joseph. They were tired of his attitude. They were tired that he was the favorite. And they were probably tired about the dreams that he kept saying that he was someday going to rule over them. In anger and jealousy, they threw Joseph into the cistern, into the well, to stage his death and then sell him into slavery. You know, I have needed to forgive family members before, but I have never had to forgive anyone for something like this. Joseph may have had an attitude problem, true, but selling him into slavery as retaliation was not cool at all. Now, you already know how this story ends. Joseph saves the lives of his brothers and forgives them for what they did to him. Joseph forgives his brothers, but when their father Jacob dies, the brothers get scared that Joseph will change his mind and try to get revenge. Because they're connected through their parents, and what if he only forgave them because of his father? They know they haven't really deserved the forgiveness and kindness that Joseph has given them. So let's read Genesis 50, 15 to 21 together and talk about what happens. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" Which would be a pretty bad payback, am I right? Because they sold him into slavery. How do you come back from that? So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done in the saving of many lives. So don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph had risen up in the ranks of government. He had a high place, and he was now able to A, kill his whole family, or B, save his whole family and forgive them. And what he chose was forgiveness. Joseph had every reason to be angry at his brothers. But Joseph chose forgiveness instead of bitterness. Joseph chose forgiveness instead of holding on to anger and letting it eat him up and impact his relationship. I don't know about you, but when I am fighting with family, because let's face it, we're stuck with family, it eats me up alive. I think about it all day. I think about it at night. It impacts my sleep. It impacts my ability to focus. Forgiveness can help take that away. Many years after Joseph forgave his brothers, Jesus preached a sermon to a group of his followers. And Matthew 18:21 and 22 says this, "Then Peter came up to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?' And Jesus answered, 'I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times.'" And then Jesus goes on to tell a parable about a man who had been forgiven a huge debt. It was forgiveness he didn't deserve. But then when someone asked the same man to forgive them of their debt, he refused. Here was Jesus' point. God has forgiven you of so much already. So give some of that forgiveness to each other. The kind of forgiveness Joseph showed his brothers is not typical. It's hard to understand, but that's the forgiveness that God has shown to us through Jesus. Throughout this series, we've been saying that if you want God to use your family to do atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do that. That's what Joseph did, and it's what Jesus teaches us to do. When you've been hurt by someone in your family, the typical response is to get bitter or get revenge. But Joseph chose something different. He showed his brothers forgiveness, kindness, and compassion, and we can do that too, because not so typical families forgive each other. In a second, I'm going to share some action steps that we can all take towards forgiveness, but first I want to acknowledge that this conversation might be confusing to some people. You might have a family member who has hurt you so deeply or so repeatedly that the idea of forgiving them like Joseph forgave his brothers seems impossible. And let me be really clear. If anyone in your family or not in your family has hurt you or continues to hurt you physically, emotionally, sexually, then this conversation of forgiveness is actually not for you. If this is your story, God is not telling you to move on, forget it, be nice to them, protect them from their consequences of their actions. That is not the point of this conversation. If that is your story, I want you to tell an adult right now. Now, if that's not you, if you need forgiveness for something like stealing a cookie or borrowing someone's sweater and not giving it back, or stealing someone's friend, or lying about your sibling to your parents, or lying to your parents, or your parents lying to you, or something like that, this is for you, right? We are not talking about forgiving someone who has continued to hurt you. That's not what this conversation is about. We can talk about forgiveness in those situations in a different setting. That's not what this is. So if that's what you want to talk about, reach out to me, text me, call me, and we can talk about that differently. If you are actively being hurt, then you need to tell an adult right now. Like, stop the video now, right this second, and tell someone. So, if your story is more like stealing a cookie or stealing someone's sweater or lying about something, we're going to keep talking about that, because just like forgiveness changed Joseph and his family for the better, being eager to forgive can change your family for the better too. So how do you forgive a family member when they've hurt you? Forgiveness doesn't have to be as complicated as it seems. It could be as simple as admitting you've been hurt, telling God you need help to forgive someone, asking God to heal the parts of your heart that have been hurt, choosing to focus on moving forward instead of focusing on what happened in the past, forgiving yourself and asking for forgiveness, if you need to, for the part you played in what happened. Could forgiveness change your attitude or perspective? How do you think forgiveness could change the person you're fighting with? How do you think forgiveness could begin to change your family's pattern of behavior in the long term? Forgiveness is tough, but isn't it amazing that we get the opportunity to forgive others in the same way God has forgiven us? After this video, here's what I want you to do. I want you to identify someone in your family you need to forgive. Write their name down and pray for them. And I want you to think about why you want to forgive them. Is it because you're tired of feeling angry? Because you don't want to become bitter? Maybe it's because you miss having a close relationship with them. Maybe this fight is separating you from something that could be awesome. Write that down too. And then what I want you to do is hang on to this. Hang on to this card where you wrote down someone in your family that you need to forgive and why you need to forgive them. And let it be a reminder of your commitment to forgive instead of taking revenge. Forgiveness is a process, so while you learn to forgive, you may need to be reminded of why it's worth it. Forgiveness is something that we can offer to those who have hurt us, but it's also a gift we give ourselves. Unforgiveness leaves us feeling bitter, angry, closed off to others, and even empty. But when we let God help us forgive, we find healing and hope and freedom. We've talked about a lot of difficult things in the past couple weeks, and that's because families can be pretty difficult sometimes. But our imperfect families aren't hopeless. Like Adam and Eve, not so typical families can be used by God. Like Abraham and Lot, not so typical families pray for each other. Like Jacob and Esau, not so typical families have tough conversations together. And like Joseph and his brothers, not so typical families forgive each other. It's not your job to fix your family. But if you want to see your family used by God to do atypical things in the world, you have a role to play. Pray for your family. Have tough conversations with your family. Forgive your family. When it comes to your family, don't be typical. Take that step to pray, to have tough conversations, and to forgive. And it just might change your family for the better.